Welcome. The title of this lecture is A Survey of the Art of the High Italian Renaissance. Now this lecture is dedicated to an examination of the art after the early Italian Renaissance. The High Italian Renaissance lasts from around 1495 until about 1520. Now these dates are not set in stone, so if you look elsewhere you may see different dates for the High Renaissance, perhaps in the around 1490, perhaps in the 1480s even. But the High Italian Renaissance really revolves around three artists. These are three of the greatest artists that Italy has ever produced, three of the greatest artists the world has ever seen. And these are Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael Sanzio, and Michelangelo Buonarroti. Now these artists produced some of the greatest works the world has ever seen. This lecture, however, is concerned only with some of their what you might call the greatest hits. This will highlight some of the most important works of theirs in painting and in sculpture. And in doing so, I hope to give you some general idea of what is going on during this point in time and how the artists of the High Renaissance really took what had already been gained in the world of art in the early Renaissance and elevated it to a whole new level. Now the first question is, what do we mean by the term High Renaissance? Well, art historians use the term High Renaissance to refer to a specific time period within the larger Renaissance period at which performance was at its peak in terms of the level of virtuosity. There was a high level of naturalism in the figures and the locations which were depicted. And the status of artists themselves was also raised, and they became sort of like celebrities in their own right. Now it is important to remember that the artists of the High Renaissance did not exist in a vacuum, but they actually came about learning within the same tradition of the many artists who came about in the early Renaissance. And so these High Renaissance artists borrowed a lot of the ideas that were developed in the decades beforehand. Some of these ideas included one-point linear perspective, contrapposto stance in sculpture, level of chiaroscuro, and so forth. And while art historians refer to this period as the High Renaissance, I just wanted to point out at this point in time that after about 1520 or so, we enter, or the world of art enters into a phase which is generally considered to be the late Renaissance. So we go from early Renaissance to High Renaissance to late Renaissance. And this lecture, of course, only covers the middle of those, the High Renaissance. The first of the three great High Renaissance artists that we will take a look at in this lecture is Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519. Now, Leonardo was born in the region around or nearby Florence, but he would spend much of his career working in the city of Milan in northern Italy. He had trained with Verrocchio, who was an artist, a great master of the early Renaissance period. So we know that Leonardo was able to learn some of the principles of early Renaissance art during his training. Leonardo had an interest in a wide range of subjects such as zoology, botany, engineering, anatomy. Basically, he was very interested in the natural world. We have some of his interesting sketches left over, some of his inventions and some of his sketches depicting the human body and so forth. So basically Leonardo had many different fields from which to draw and to help inform him about his works of art that he was producing during his lifetime. Here we have an early work of Leonardo's which was painted in the late 15th century. It shows five figures who had been portrayed many times in the past. We have first of all the Virgin Mary, who is located in the center, and just to her left, or to our right, on the right side of the painting, is an angel, and that angel looks out towards us, the viewer. The angel points to a little child who also has the Virgin's hand around him. Now, most often I think that we would think of this child whom the Virgin Mary is touching as the Christ child, but in fact this is not. It's actually St. John the Baptist. You can see how he kneels and has his hands clasped in adoration, looking at the child who is further to the right. And that is the Christ child, that child who's closer to the center of the painting. The Virgin's hand kind of hovers over Christ, but she doesn't actually touch him. Christ, meanwhile, has his hand up in a type of blessing gesture to John. So we have all these figures who are interacting in one way or another, which provides an interesting dynamic to this figural grouping. The figures are arranged so that they're all together in a pyramid-like shape, with the Virgin at the apex of the pyramid. This is the sort of composition, the pyramidal composition, which would be popular in the High Renaissance. Leonardo places all these figures in a mystical type of setting, one which is very rocky, and it looks like they are in some kind of cave or a grotto. As you look back and to the left, you can see the landscape disappear into the mist. It almost looks like a gloomy scene. Traditionally, the birth of Christ was believed to have taken place in a cave, and so here we are, even though Christ isn't a newborn here. But it's possible that Leonardo wanted to use this to contrast the darkness of the grotto with the lightness of Christ, who came into this world through the Virgin Mary. In any case, the contrast between the dark cave in the background and the lightness and tenderness exhibited by the Holy Family and the other figures is an interesting aspect of this work, and as we'll see in a few moments, Leonardo would explore the contrast between background and foreground in a later, very famous portrait painting that he made. In any case, Leonardo did a very good job at modeling his figures. Earlier in the 15th century, painters such as Masaccio were able to depict natural-looking scenes by using one-point linear perspective and by using chiaroscuro, which is simply the use of light and shade to create painted figures or something else that looks like it actually occupies 3 dimensions in space. Now, Leonardo also uses light and shade to model his figures, but he does so in a way which is extremely fine, so that there's a very subtle transition between light and dark areas, such as on the figures and their faces and their other parts of their body. It's a kind of smoky transition between light and dark, and so the name for this extremely fine level of chiaroscuro is actually called sfumato, which is spelled S-F-U-M-A-T-O, and this is one of the hallmarks of Leonardo's painting. So here, with the Madonna of the Rocks, or the Virgin of the Rocks, as it's also called, we see Leonardo pushing painting to ever more naturalism, and done in a way in which the painted figures become very intimate in their nature. Leonardo was interested in studying human psychology by means of painting, and we can see that in limited ways here in their facial expressions. The angel's face in particular, that glance is perhaps the most revealing, and later on in later works we'll see more of this kind of conveyed emotion, which will become even more evident. So overall, we have a unified figural composition, and the figures are also unified through their gestures and glances back and forth between one another and then out towards us, the viewers. They are convincingly set in what appears to be a real-world setting of a cave or a grotto. And painting by this time, by Leonardo's time, he is really elevated to a new level. Leonardo is considered to be the first of the real great high Renaissance masters. So this is one of his earlier works, which he paints towards the beginning of this period.